First, to understand is that Magna Carta is probably the greatest and most beneficial unintended consequence in history. You know, you've got a bunch of hooligans, really, barons, demanding their rights from a hooligan king. And really, it's just that central idea that there is such a thing as a right to justice, and such a thing as justice that really sort of comes through it all.
Well, you're quite right. It was, of course, addressing contemporary problems, but it was also putting down a benchmark. And the right to trial by jury stems from Magna Carta. To no one will I deny or sell justice, and all that, you know.
It is a defining moment in our legal and constitutional history, and the establishment of the principle of due process of law remains as relevant today as it was then.
I think one of the most important things about Magna Carta was the fact that it was an attempt to limit the arbitrary power of the monarch.
Whilst that's feudal and 13th century, in another way it shows you that anybody who loses touch with the gap between the ruled and the rulers will ultimately find themselves in trouble.
Well, it opened a door, didn't it? It didn't solve or address any of the problems of today, or many of them, but it said that power should not be arbitrary, that there were liberties that had to be guaranteed for most people, not all by any means, but for most people. And so that opened the door.
The individual provisions are somewhat irrelevant now because, as you say, they concern 13th century issues like fishing rights and that sort of thing. But as a concept of trying to get the King of England round a table and essentially forcing him to agree to certain conditions, certain rights, if you like, I think this was hugely significant.
What Magna Carta did, initially in two clauses, but more because of the spirit that went on with it, was the concept of the limit of the power of the ruler, power of the state.
It also effectively consolidated the position of the Church in England, but it has a continuing relevance because this was the first time that what we would now call civil liberties and human rights were codified.
Essentially, the barons had forced the king. It was a compromise, and they'd forced the king to come to terms and issue this great charter. So it's hugely significant as an attempt on the part of subjects to limit the sovereign's power. And I think that's one of the first instances of this anywhere in the world, really.
There are absolute powers around committing, in some cases, dreadful crimes, but in some cases governing with to their own will and whim. And the lessons of that the power should never be arbitrary, it should always be shared, liberties should always be considered, is the same one as it was all that while ago.
The powerful idea is that a society has got to operate with due process of law, and arbitrary action by people in power is unacceptable. And people can understand that idea, and it's obviously very relevant across the world today, where people are fighting about arbitrary power. And so I think it's that very simple idea, which is very removed from many of the very detailed clauses in Magna Carta, which is why Magna Carta is still referred to and seen as being relevant.
And the principle that the sovereign, the state if you like, should be subject to that law is a vital cornerstone of our democracy, and a principle that still isn't in place in a significant number of countries around the world.
And of course it is really the foundation of the Constitution of the United States and of many other countries. So it is one of the seminal documents of world history.
So it's that, one thing else, it's an inchoate, incoherent almost, but very, very important feeling that everybody has a right to justice. Today, from my computer, I could monitor 1,000 people, 1 million people, 50 million people, and store it all too. Now, so there is no natural limit, as it were, to the power of intrusion of the state.
I think the debate about freedom and security is going to continue, because I think that the developments over the last few years, increase in terrorism, has actually instilled fear in people. And there is a dilemma in terms of how do we maintain our freedom and yet protect ourselves. I think that, to my mind, is going to be a continuing issue. But it's going to require a bit of courage and a sense of perspective, that it's very easy to lose your freedom, and it's important that these things are maintained. And the other one, which of course is important, is freedom of speech, the ability to have a dialogue, discuss, and so on. To me, I think those are critical issues. So I see over the next few years that this is going to be an ongoing issue. And obviously, when we're looking at antisocial behavior and how you curtail issues to do with blasphemy and others, where do you draw the line between freedom of speech and people's ability to respect others?
I think one of the big emerging issues today, which we haven't really solved, question we haven't really answered, is the degree to which the massive or incredible changes in technology with regard to the internet, particularly emails, all that sort of thing, has extended, or may well have extended, the power of the state to track emails, the surveillance state, if you like. I think given where we were, even in the early 80s, it's clear that governments have huge potential, huge opportunities to track and follow what the individual is doing. And we haven't really, I think, addressed, whether, if any, that there should be boundaries to governments behaving in this way. And you look at what's been happening, Assange and Snowden, all these sorts of people. It's no accident that those sort of civil liberties issues which they raised were relating to the internet, essentially, particularly in the case or technology, satellites, all that sort of thing. And I think, if you were to look maybe 50, 60 years ago, the capacity of the state to follow individuals, to track individuals, was more limited than it is today. And I think we probably need, from an intellectual point of view, we need to distill and work out what it is that we're prepared for governments to be able to do.
Well, we only have to watch television at the moment, what's happening in Central Africa. There are just ghastly events going on of, tribal feuding, religious feuding, where the most terrible, bestial acts are taking place. And they have to be right up there amongst them. And Syria, of course, and other countries like that, where actually, we're standing back and not doing very much. I'm involved with an organization called Women for Women International, and through my wife actually, and we do work in post-conflict zones, so countries which have been destroyed by civil war mainly, and what happens to women in those countries afterwards. So I've been lucky enough to go to countries like Bosnia, Kosovo, Rwanda, and actually see what happens to these people after these conflicts. And we all stood by. Every one of us stood by while this is going on. And believe me, when Syria is over and when all the borders are opened, we're going to see things that have happened there that we cannot believe. And we're all going to look at each other and say, we knew, we had an inkling, and we did nothing. And I think we're going to regret that we didn't take action on it.
The other big freedoms issue, I suspect, will come out of the aftermath of the battles with terrorism and the foreign wars that the major Western countries have gone in for. Not directly, but indirectly. There'll be a lot of things that the governments don't want in the public domain. So recently in Britain, for example, we've agreed, over my protests, to what they call closed material procedures. They're secret courts. And these are quite small, they don't affect many people, but the raw truth is that if you steal freedom from one person, you're stealing freedom from everybody. If you steal justice from one person, you're stealing justice from all of society. And there'll be a lot of those edgewise apparently minor but actually quite serious erosions of individual freedoms and rights.
Parliament should be the ultimate guardian, protector, and advancer of rights.
I'm a great believer in the sovereignty of Parliament. The courts essentially interpret law, but that law comes from Parliament, as it has done since, well, the beginning of the 14th century. Laws are passed through Parliament by representatives of the people, the members of Parliament.
Well, I mean, the only way you can do it is by the courts interpreting the law. At one level, it's very straightforward. If there is a view that the law needs changing and rights need to be extended, first of all, it's for Parliament to do it. We've done it within the last year on the Same-Sex Marriage Bill, or Same-Sex Marriage Act as it now is. We've extended rights, which has followed an extensive public debate. So the order is, there is a public debate about an issue. There is a momentum to change the existing legal framework. Parliament reflects the will of the people and changes it. The courts then interpret it. And I think that's the sort of the common process that you go through whenever there's a suggestion that we need to strengthen rights, which is always happening.
That is a very difficult question to answer, because whatever answer I gave you will only apply to the UK. But we do not live in a national world anymore. This is a global environment that we live in. So whatever rules and regulations we have in this country are actually worthless, because some other country, or even no country, some stateless environment, can have their own rules and regulations that could just nullify everything that's going on there.
One says, oh, the law is powerful, but who makes the law? And can the law be changed? And can it be sometimes rather bent and distorted? In some countries it is. So these are all questions that are very much unsettled after, we've never had 800 years of it, but we still haven't solved a lot of these issues.
Today it's really between the executive, the government, Parliament, and the courts, and the most important thing is that the balance exists rather than who's most powerful.
For me, anniversaries have two purposes. One is reaffirmation of what's important, and I think it's a time for reflection to see what happened and how important Magna Carta has been, and to ignite in people the memory of it, and then begin to see how it's relevant to the modern day.
Well, I think if Magna Carta is about an idea, what the anniversary should be seeking to achieve is to explain to people, A, what the idea is, to the extent they don't know already, but secondly, why it matters.
I think it is more an opportunity, and the opportunity really is to raise awareness, particularly among the young, and also to make sure that they don't just think this is a kind of a one-off day, on the 15th of June, it's an event.
We're also having a number of events during 12/15, one of which is similar to your Congress in Egham later this year. It's going to be a Congress for young people from around the world on the themes of the rule of law, human rights, civil liberties, all of which trace their origin back to this extraordinary piece of parchment.
People will now be discussing issues about rights, which are very, very, very far removed from what was in the minds of the barons when Magna Carta was signed. But the idea is the same idea. What are appropriate rights? And having a debate, using the anniversary to trigger that debate, I think is just very valuable.
It'd be important to have events around it and after it, so you can sustain the interest of young people and make sure that through the digital media and social media, they can actually engage in debates and what it means for them. So I would like to see a lot more participation.
And I think it is an opportunity to say to young people, look, this truly is relevant to your lives. This is where it all began. And when you talk about human rights, when you talk about civil liberties, this is the seminal document.
Well, I think my advice really would be that they first of all got to understand the history of the Magna Carta, because you can't look ahead unless you look back, and proper understanding of the history is important.
Well, I suppose, first of all, they should look at the Declaration of Rights that exist in this country and in others. I mean, obviously, the American Declaration of Rights and the Constitution in France too, the rights of man, and bring these into effect.
Not to forget the roots of our freedoms, the importance of rights of free speech, a free parliament, a free press, a separate judiciary. These are the things on which our liberties are built. But then to meet the challenge of our age.
I think they should look at society in the round, in terms of British society, in every aspect. They should look at regional differences in terms of wealth distribution, in terms of how the economy across the country is very different.
You might have to protect the rights of people who you don't like or whose views you don't necessarily represent. So don't just think about your own comforts and privileges.
Well, I think at one level it's quite a difficult job. As a lawmaker, making law is a lot more difficult once you start doing it than it seems when you're sort of chatting about it.
Perhaps one thing, given the age that we live in today, and the fact that so much is geared by technology and the internet and everything's occurring, perhaps to think about our rights as human beings in a Facebook, social media type environment, and to see how this ought to be positioned.
You have, of course, rights, but you also have responsibilities. And your prime responsibility is to safeguard the democracy that you have inherited and to hand it on in a more vibrant and a fitter form to future generations.
I think the challenge for them is to work out in their own mind what is really matters. What is it that they feel about the way we do things at the moment in respect of rights that could be improved? Because that's what they've got to then distill into any clauses that they're drafting.
Justice is a living thing. Freedom is a living thing. Privacy is a living thing. And it should relate to your daily life and what's important to you. And so the ability of the state to look at the internet is very, very different today than it was 25 years ago when it didn't exist. And so make the thing relevant to your daily lives. Make it relevant to what you think is important.
I also suppose you've got to think of modern threats that might not have been there, whether they're through technology or the abuse of technology or the abuse of power, the facelessness of institutions because they're too remote.
Because the world has truly changed, and maybe we do need a new Declaration of Rights enshrined in, shall we say, a techno Magna Carta that would be appropriate for this.
They should obviously look at issues regarding gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation. I mean, they should try and take Britain in its entirety, or insofar as they can, look at a much wider spectrum of British society than is often the case in these types of conventions.
Secondly would be the evolution. Secondly, to see where there is the real opportunities there are and what are the dangers for the future to our freedoms, and therefore what kind of future they want for themselves, and against that background to begin to draft a charter. But I think the important thing is the act of their engagement.
I think it's trying to see if you can get down to first principles that says, how can I as a citizen have rights that relate to the European Union or the National Health Service or the Ministry of Defence or the United Nations or anybody else of that kind. But try to sort of tie it back and say, if you think these organisations are legitimate, but you worry that they might abuse the citizen, how can you define your rights in ways that protect the independence of the citizen without destroying the effectiveness of the institution? That's the kind of balance I think you have to work for.
And so, don't opt out. Get yourself involved.
I mean, the danger is you get a bunch of people that exaggerate from the southeast, middle-class people from the southeast talking about middle-class things. And I think an opportunity is afforded in something, the project you describe, of actually looking at a whole range of issues across a wide degree of regions. So they should be looking at the countryside, they should be looking at planning and all sorts of issues, I think.
And I hope that it is done through debate, because part of a good democratic process is the ability to debate and have a dialogue and come to a consensus. And I think the process is going to be just as important as the outcome.
And then I think if they have that sort of holistic picture, I think there'll be quite an interesting document in terms of, rights and responsibilities people have across the country, or should have across the country.
I couldn't care less what your individual political views may be, but please use the various forums that you have, councils, parliament, etc. Aspire to join some of them, play a part, and you have a responsibility as you go out into the world to make the society into which you were born a better society when you leave it than when you joined it.
I'm absolutely convinced that if we're going to make the maximum use of the Magna Carta celebration in 2015, it must be community-led.
I think it's absolutely essential. I think that it'll only work in terms of engaging people in the networks that you describe, through schools, through universities, with some sort of community angle. I mean, people are very community-minded, certainly in this part of the world. Particularly in Spelthorne, we've got our own museum, Spelthorne Museum. And I think that's going to be a key factor in driving awareness.
The roots of our justice system, the roots of our democracy, the roots of our freedom lie with the people, not with the government.
People tend to think of democracy as, Parliament and politicians, at the central level. But when I talk about participation, I think it's important because, in a way, children who participate in that, apart from learning, also learn democratic processes, because, it's learning to be a democratic citizen. That's what citizenship is about.
If the anniversary is just a series of events of the great and the good in Parliament, that makes us feel better, but it doesn't really have any impact.
You can put on big nationally organised or regionally organised events for a day or so, but if you want to really make a mark, you have to spend time with people, you have to make the effort to go with the grain of how the community works.
Actually, what matters at the end of the day is not what people in this building think. What matters is the people they represent. And what you're doing is creating a community of understanding which will inform another generation, so that our freedoms will be as strong then as they are today.
The fact that it's a bottom-up community initiative that the museum is taking is, I think, for Magna Carta a thoroughly good thing, because the fundamental point of Magna Carta was that it was a bottom-up initiative. It was people less grand than the king, though quite grand people in those days, but people who were less grand than the king, who were saying to the king, there are going to have to be limits to your power and authority. And for that tradition to survive in the modern age, to be cherished, is going to depend upon people from the bottom up, citizens, continuing to affirm that these rights are important and to demand that they have them.